Alright, it's time to change the rear tire on my 2005 VTX 1800. I'm How To Bob, and this is how I remove and replace the wheel. First thing, jack the bike up. I've got a motorcycle jack here, and I want to jack it up just high enough for now to get the tire off. I'm going to remove the cap for the brake pad pin, and then I want to remove the brake pad pin. It is a Allen or hex head, and it just slides right out. Next, I'm going to remove the caliper itself from the caliper bracket, and that just unscrews here. And then I want to spread my brakes just slightly. Once I get this caliper off here, you want to make sure that you don't press on the brakes while the caliper has no resistance. So I've got that spread just a little bit, and I'm going to pull my brake pads out now. They look like they're in fairly good shape, so I don't need to replace those. I'll save that for another time, and I'll stick to replacing the tire for right now. So now I've got my caliper loose. You can see there's an extra pin here. I can move on and start to get the tire off. So you can see on the left hand side of the bike, I'm using a 12mm hex to hold the center of the axle while I loosen the nut on the right hand side, and you'll see it comes all the way out and it's going to hit the exhaust, but that's okay because I'm going to use a socket extension, put it against the edge of the axle, and knock the axle over to the left hand side. Once I get it to come out a little bit, I'll be able to remove the axle nut and then continue pushing the axle all the way to the left hand side of the bike. So I just continue to tap on the axle until it comes loose, and there we go. Now I can just pull the axle all the way out. I'm going to go back over to the other side, and I'm going to lift the caliper bracket up, and I'm going to remove the axle spacer. And then I'm going to take the caliper off of the caliper bracket. All this stuff has to be removed to give the wheel enough space to get out from underneath the fender. I've got a hanger that I've got to suspend the caliper. You don't want to hang the caliper from the hoses, just to protect the hose. Now I do need to loosen up the exhaust just so that I can get enough clearance to get in between. So I'm going to remove the two hanger bolts on the bottom of the exhaust here. That ought to give me just enough room to push the exhaust out far enough to get in between. Let's see, there's a bolt, you can barely see it down in here, and this holds the caliper bracket on. It's really tight. You may have to use an extension on a wrench to loosen it up. So that's what I had to move the exhaust out to get to. I've got a ratcheting wrench. Once it gets going, I can use my ratcheting wrench. Now I'm going to spread this out a little bit. The bolt that I just loosened doesn't have to come all the way out. I just want to get it out far enough to get it out of the way so that I can remove my caliper bracket here. Once I get my caliper bracket out, set that off to the side, and then I can push the tire from the left hand side of the bike and it'll come loose from the hub, and you can see it's just inside the fender well, just real loose. Now I'm going to have to jack the bike up a little bit higher to be able to slide the tire out from the fender. On the 2005 VTX R, the fender is really big and has to be up pretty high. So now I've got my tire out. I'm going to go get it replaced. While I've got that being mounted and balanced, I'm going to go ahead and clean up my axle and lube up the splines on my rear end here, my differential. So I'll put a little grease around the splines and get it all set up and ready to go. I've got my tire back on the rim, ready to go. Use a little bit more grease around the hub on the tire here. Not too much, just enough. And I'm going to grease up the axle as well. And then the next thing I'm going to grease up is the bearings. I'm going to add a little bit of bearing grease to the inside, work it in to the bearings, and on the other side as well, just work in the grease. So I'm going to set up my brakes now. I use a brake disc quiet, and I just put that across the pad, the back of the pad. Put a little line across the back of the pad here. And what this does is helps with the vibration and keeps it from squeaking. Once I get the line on there, I can smear a nice coating around the back of the pad, and that'll keep my brakes nice and quiet. Let that set up for a minute, and I'll work on getting my tire back in. Just kind of put it in where it belongs. Then I can go over to my jack and slowly lower the bike to the correct height. Once I get close, I'm going to take my axle and kind of set it in the hole just a little bit, and I might have to raise and or lower the bike just a little bit to get it lined up. So I got it pretty well lined up. Then I want to take the tire, the rim, the whole wheel, and I want to put it inside the splines. And it might take a minute to line those up. So you just have to lift the tire up a little bit and rotate it ever so slightly till the gears line up inside the rear end here. And you'll feel it when it clicks in. Once it clicks in, it'll go all the way inside the hub. And there it goes. It's sliding in now. Now I've got the hub lined up. I can tap my axle all the way through. I have to lift up on the wheel a little bit just to tap the axle in. And go around to the other side, and I'll get my axle spacer, and I want to put a little grease on that as well. Work it in, and I can put my axle spacer in at this point. Goes in like this. And you want to make sure that doesn't get pushed out by the axle as you tap it in. Then I'm going to use some brake lubricant, and that goes along all the spots where the brake pads meet the caliper bracket. Anywhere it slides, this just makes the brake operate smoother, and again, it'll keep it from squealing and squeaking and making all kinds of grinding noises. Any spot that has any motion to it, just don't make sure you don't get any on the brake pads themselves. And I can put my caliper back on the caliper bracket here, slide right in the hole here, and then take my caliper bracket and slide it down in between the wheel and the exhaust. And I have to spread this apart just a little bit to get that bolt, my caliper bracket bolt in. So I'll use a little bar here to pull my exhaust out just a little bit. Hold that out while I get everything into place. It's kind of hard to see down in here. Once I get this bolt in here, I'll be able to show you. So I'm going to push that bolt in. And there we go. So now I can tap my axle all the way in. As I tap the axle in, I want to make sure everything on the right hand side is lined up. I want to rotate the tire, make sure everything stays in place. Make sure my axle spacer on the right hand side is all in place, and I can tap it all the way in. And there we go. It's all the way through to the other side now. And I want to clean off the grease that I put on there. Some of it got on the threads. I like to put some Loctite on the threads before I put the nut on. Just an extra level of safety. Got my Loctite on there. Now I can put my axle nut on the axle. Once I get that all the way tightened by hand, I'll use my wrench on the right hand side and my 12mm Allen or hex socket, and I'll tighten up the axle. You can tighten it by the left hand side or by the right hand side. get a little bit better leverage on the right hand side. Got that all tight. Now while I have my caliper loose, I'm going to put my brake pad spring in place. It's just a little bit easier while the caliper's loose. Once I get that in place, I can then start putting my caliper bracket bolt back in and tighten that up. Next, I'm going to install my brake pad pin, and I want to make sure that O-ring is in good shape, and I'll put a little bit of brake lube on there before I put it in. And I have to slide my pads in the correct position before the pin gets pushed through the holes in the brake pad. So as I put my pad in position, I can then push the pad pin through the hole. Before I do that, I'm going to put a little bit of Loctite on the threads, and I can line everything up and slide the pin through the hole in the pad. Once it gets to the threads, I'll have to use my Allen bit to tighten it up. Now my pads are in place, and I'm going to, again, anything that slides on the brakes, I'm going to lube up my caliper pin here, and I'll put that back in place, and then I'll tighten that up next. Now I've got that all tightened up. I'm going to put my dust cap on my brake caliper pin here, and all that's left to do is put my exhaust bolts back in. So I have to move the exhaust up a little bit and hold it in place while I put the bolts in my exhaust. Get those in place, and then I can tighten up my exhaust. So once I get the exhaust bolts tightened up, I want to make sure I pump the brakes before riding the bike, and I'll turn the wheel and make sure everything works smoothly. If you like this video, check out some of my other VTX or motorcycle videos. This is how to change the rear wheel on a 2005 Honda VTX. I'm How To Bob. Thanks for watching.